The locker room hadn't even had time to go quiet. The game was barely over. The stadium lights were still burning. The cameras were still rolling outside. And somewhere in the depths of Dodger Stadium, before the cleats had finished scraping against the concrete floor, a decision had already been made. Not one decision. Two. Two names. Two futures. Both of them erased from the active roster in a single motion, a GM's pen moving across paper while the rest of the team was still trying to make sense of what had just happened on the field. This is what a purge looks like in baseball. Not slow. Not patient. Immediate. Andrew Friedman didn't wait for the morning. He didn't wait for the debrief. He didn't wait for the coffee to brew or the plane to land or the pain to settle. The moment the final out was recorded, something had already been set in motion. Two key players. Designated for assignment. One sent down. No ceremony. No warning. Just a phone call and a number removed from the lineup card. For most teams, this would be a footnote. A transaction buried on page 7 of a sports wire. But this wasn't most teams. And the timing of it, immediate, almost ruthless, turned a roster move into something that felt much larger than any single game. There was a reason people were talking about it. There was a reason Dave Roberts picked up the phone. The call came while Roberts was still away from the stadium. He hadn't been in the dugout for the game. He hadn't been on the field. He hadn't been in the manager's office with his eyes fixed on the scoreboard. He'd been absent, physically removed from the very environment where these decisions ripple hardest, and yet the moment the news broke inside that clubhouse, someone reached for the phone and dialed his number. Tell him of this decision. Those 4 words. That was the message. Not a debate. Not a consultation. Not a request for his opinion. A notification. A directive moving in one direction, from the front office outward, settling on Roberts' ears from miles away. And Roberts, a man who has managed Shohei Ohtani through two-way returns, through record-breaking seasons, through moments that didn't seem possible until they were happening in front of his eyes, Roberts received that call and understood what it meant. The organization was sending a signal. Not to the fans. Not to the press. To the room. But then came the part that changed the story entirely. Sheehan. The name that attached itself to this moment. The name that, in a matter of hours, became the detail everyone was asking about. Because what followed the GM's decision, what followed the phone calls and the paperwork and the directive passed down through channels, was a gesture that no transaction wire can capture. Sheehan walked into the room. And he pulled Ohtani's jersey. Think about that image for a moment. Not a press release. Not a statement issued through the team's official channels. A person. A hand. A jersey. The physical act of reaching out and making contact with the one player in that locker room who exists above the noise, above the roster moves, above the turbulence that front office decisions create. Why? That is the question that didn't have an easy answer. Was it to involve him in the conversation? Was it to explain what had happened before he heard it elsewhere? Was it to make sure the locker room's most important presence understood the reasoning, or at least understood that the reasoning existed? Or was it something simpler? Something quieter? A moment between an organization and its cornerstone, in the immediate aftermath of a defeat, saying, "We are still moving in one direction. And you are still at the center of it." Nobody inside that room spoke publicly about what was said. Nobody repeated the words that passed between them. What remained was only the image, Sheehan's hand on the fabric of that jersey, and the weight of what it suggested. Defeat has a way of accelerating things. In winning, organizations are patient. They rationalize. They absorb. They tell themselves that the player who struggled tonight will be better next week, that the roster construction will work itself out, that the process is sound even when the results aren't. Winning creates tolerance. It creates time. Losing removes it. And when a team with the Dodgers' expectations, a team built to win not just games but October, suffers the kind of defeat that forces a conversation, the front office doesn't have the luxury of patience. Friedman has never pretended otherwise. The moves he makes aren't emotional. They're calculated. They're cold in the way that good organizational decisions need to be cold, stripped of sentiment, evaluated only on the question of whether they improve the team's chances tomorrow, and the day after, and 4 months from now when the games that actually decide things begin. 2 players designated or demoted. That is not a coincidence. That is not an accident of timing. That is a message being sent to a 26-man roster that the margin for contribution is real, and the organization is paying attention. Every player in that locker room saw it. Every player understood it. You don't need a meeting called. You don't need a speech. You don't need Roberts standing in front of the room and making an announcement. The moves themselves do the speaking. The moves say, nobody is untouchable. Nobody is protected by yesterday's performance. What matters is what you do next. Except one person. And everyone in that room knew who that exception was. This is the paradox at the center of the Dodgers universe right now. A team that operates on accountability, that moves quickly, that cuts losses without apology, that treats every roster spot as a question that must be continuously re-answered, built itself around a player who has never needed to answer that question. Not because he is immune to failure. Not because he is above criticism. But because what Ohtani does exists in a category that no organizational framework was designed to evaluate. He bats first. He takes the mound. He finishes an inning and walks back to the dugout and picks up a bat and does it again. The translation of what that means into a front office spreadsheet has never been fully solved. How do you assign a replacement value to someone who cannot be replaced? How do you build accountability structures around a player whose accountability is self-generating, who brings more pressure on himself than any external consequence could ever produce? You don't. You pull his jersey. You make sure he knows what's happening, and why, and that the organization is still moving in the direction both of you agreed on. You treat the conversation not as a warning, because Ohtani needs no warning, but as a courtesy. A gesture of respect that says, you matter enough to hear this from us directly. Not from a wire. Not from a reporter's phone. From us. That is what Sheehan's move communicated. Not panic. Not chaos. Not an organization spinning out of control after a difficult loss. An organization in full command of its direction, making the difficult decisions it needed to make, and choosing, deliberately, to anchor those decisions around its most important player rather than let them drift into noise. Dave Roberts, still away, still on the other end of that phone line, understood all of this. He has managed Ohtani long enough to know that the relationship between the player and the organization is not a simple one. Ohtani does not need to be managed in the way that most players need to be managed. He does not need to be motivated. He does not need to be protected from difficult truths. What he needs, what he has always needed, is clarity. Honesty. The sense that the people around him are operating with complete information and making decisions for the right reasons. Roberts understood that the call he received wasn't a crisis call. It was an information call. A courtesy extended to the person most responsible for putting the pieces together on the field, a brief, necessary communication that the pieces were already shifting, and would continue to shift, because that is what this organization does. The absence of Roberts from the stadium made the call more significant, not less. It meant that the front office was not waiting for him to return. It meant that Friedman's decision had a momentum of its own. And it meant that when Roberts did return, when he sat in front of the room again and looked at the faces in front of him, he would already know what they knew. 2 players gone. 1 jersey pulled. 1 phone call made. And a team that, for all the difficulty of a single defeat, was still being operated by people who believed they knew where this was going. Baseball rewards that belief. Not always. Not immediately. Not in the way that makes for clean narratives and satisfying timelines. But over the course of a season, 162 games of information, adjustment, and consequence, the teams that move with conviction tend to separate themselves from the teams that hesitate. The Dodgers moved with conviction. Whether that conviction was correct, whether the players designated for assignment deserved that fate, whether the demotion was the right call, whether the message sent to the locker room lands the way Friedman intended, none of that resolves itself tonight. None of it resolves itself this week. Baseball is patient in the way that front offices are not. The answer comes later. It comes in the standings. It comes in October, in a dugout, in a moment when the decisions made on a quiet night in May either look brilliant or look reckless. What is clear is this. The game ended. The room hadn't gone quiet. Friedman had already moved. Roberts had already been called. And Sheehan had already found the one jersey in that locker room that the organization felt it needed to reach before the night was over. Not to explain the decision. To acknowledge that the person wearing that jersey was still, in every way that mattered, the reason those decisions were worth making at all.